Can you go to jail for singing one of John Farnham's songs? I never thought I would be asking that question, but here we are. Welcome to 2026. Hi, my name's Hayder Shakara, an Australian lawyer, and I lead a national team of 40 lawyers across the country. And today I'm here to discuss the Queensland hate speech laws, what they mean, what it means for Queensland, what it means for the whole country, and my view as to the validity of these laws and where I see this going. All right, just to give some background, these laws were passed in the Queensland Parliament in March this year. Very controversial. They're in relation to hate speech, and the legislation specifically targets two phrases: from the river to the sea and globalize the intifada. Now, one of the main points of the legislation is that these phrases aren't automatically illegal in every single situation, but they can become criminal if they're used publicly in a way that would make someone in the public feel like they've been harassed, or if they're going to be offending somebody in the public. If you do commit that offense, you could be receiving a 2-year imprisonment sentence. So this potentially is the first time in Australian history where specific phrases had been banned from being said. And of course, that led to a huge public outcry as to limiting people's freedom of speech. And there were major concerns as to how this would actually be enforced. So we have seen actually some people being charged with these offenses. They're in front of the court at the moment. No one's been sentenced yet because it's still relatively new. And as a result of that, we then had these protests that occurred in Brisbane on the weekend, and that's where John Farnham enters the chat. So this protest was quite creative. It was obviously done in a sarcastic, satirical way in order to, I guess, incense the government, the police officers as well, that was trying to enforce these laws. And what they did was they got together and they dressed up and they sang John Farnham's song, Two Strong Hearts, because in that song, it contains lyrics that say, like a river to the sea. And obviously that isn't the exact slogan, the banned phrase, but it's very close. And I think that was done to make a point. And that is, where do you draw the line? And what happens if you use these phrases in other contexts, like in music or in art or in conversation or in an educational kind of way? Now, there was a large public gathering here and people were singing and dancing and nobody was arrested, nobody was charged. There were police officers at the scene. You can see them watching the protesters. They didn't do anything. They didn't come in to interfere. And I think overall protest organizers saw this as a big success because they got a lot of attention and they did so without getting in trouble with the law. But having said that, over the weekend, we also saw some more actions where police were actually arresting and charging people for reciting and displaying the prohibited signs. There were people wearing it on their shirts, people had signs and banners, and people were also chanting those two prohibited phrases. And as a result of that, there was a reported 20 arrests at one rally and more charges over the weekend. So it's clear police here, they're not mucking around. They are trying to enforce what Parliament has instilled. And when the police have been asked to comment on it, they themselves have said, we are just following the instructions from the politicians. Here is the law. We are just doing our best to enforce the law. And to be honest, I feel sorry for the police officers because it puts them in such a difficult position. Imagine you see a whole group of people and somebody yells out a phrase, and as a result of that, you have to arrest them because that's what the law is. You're going to probably incite a large crowd of people at the protest if you do so. It might also conflict with your personal belief system as well. So you can see how it puts the Queensland police officers in a really difficult position. So by singing this song, are you committing an offense? Could you actually go to jail as a result of this? Well, no, because in order to be guilty of the offense, you need to say the exact words, and the words are a little bit different. And on top of that, there needs to be an element of you doing so in an offensive or harassing way. So if you're just singing a song, it probably doesn't cross that threshold. But then we get into some real interesting questions like, number one, what does offend mean? You know, how do you define whether somebody has been offended in public? And I think that's where it gets really controversial because something that offends one person might offend somebody else. So then what's the threshold for determining whether someone would be offended? Because you could pretty much say any sentence in the English dictionary, and I'm sure if you ran it past 1,000 people, one of those people would find it offensive. So at this stage, I really wouldn't be testing the boundaries of using those two phrases. I think the government has made it very clear that saying it out loud or wearing it or displaying it is enough, and they're going to take that as being offensive in and of itself. So a lot of people are asking, doesn't this impede on our freedom of speech? And that sounds logical because as soon as you start banning particular phrases, it pretty much feels like you're limited in things things that you can say. And once you become limited on things you can say, then you don't have an absolute freedom of speech. And I guess the opposite side of that is, well, should people all be free to say what they want to say, even if it's hateful, even if it's inciting violence? So that's what the counter argument is to that freedom of speech argument. And remember, in Australia, we don't have a US style freedom of speech clause in our Bill of Rights. We don't have a Bill of Rights in Australia. In Australia, we have an implied freedom of political communication. It's not a personal right in the same way that the US have it, where they can say whatever they want and that's protected by this Bill of Rights. Instead, it's only something that's been implied, and that's because the High Court has interpreted the Australian Constitution to imply that we have that freedom of speech, that freedom of political communication. And in New South Wales, this implied freedom of political communication was recently tested with the protest laws, where the New South Wales Court of Appeal said that the laws the New South Wales government introduced were actually not legitimate, and they can't do that because it restricted people's implied freedom of political communication. I've previously done a video on the New South Wales Court of Appeal decision. You can check it out in my playlist of videos. And if you are enjoying this video up to this point, please like and subscribe. It really means a lot to me. Anyway, moving on. So in relation to the Queensland government, just because the New South Wales laws were struck out by the New South Wales Court of Appeal, it doesn't mean that the Queensland government's hate speech laws are going to also be struck out, but there is also very strong potential for that to happen. And I personally think that once these matters are going through court, the ones where people have been charged right now, there's going to be a challenge as to whether or not the government is able to put those restrictions in place and whether it does infringe on the rights of citizens to have that implied freedom of political communication. And if it does get tested, my belief is that I don't think it's going to stand. I think the courts are going to say that it does have too much of a burden on our implied right to freedom of political communication. Anyway, those are just my thoughts. Right now, the law still stands. Let me know what you guys think. Were these laws necessary to protect the Jewish community in Australia? Or do you think that they place too much of a burden on our rights to communicate, to protest, and our freedom of speech? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.